Nous allons écouter Céline.
We're going to listen to Céline Romainville. Do we need to introduce her? You know that she's a constitutional law professor at the Louvain University and coordinator of this project. And she's going to talk about political accountability and long-term issues. And I give her the floor right away. Thank you, Xavier. Political accountability and long-term issues on a conference on trust. So there will be 3 points. First, I will look at the links between trust and long-term accountability to identify the potential issues. And then I will analyze this problem based on the constitutional law on political accountability. And I will use what my predecessors have said in order to shorten my presentation. And I will talk about the ministerial and collective accountability of the government, and then I will analyze with you, based on the constitutional framework, some proposals that have been passed to include in a more comprehensive way the long-term in democracy. So first, political accountability and long-term issues, and then I will make 3 comments. So first, the long-term is a source of distrust of citizens, and the latest OECD study has demonstrated that citizens don't trust political institutions for long-term complex issues. So we said that the trust was generally low, but for long-term issues and complex issues, the trust is really, really low. The OECD has demonstrated that if citizens generally trust governments to manage emergencies and exceptions, so in the short term, the citizens' trust is reduced when they have to assess the ability of governments to solve long-term political issues. And the OECD has also done a study in 2023 to show that the absence of long-term vision of governments was feeding the distrust of citizens, so quite considerably. And so the OECD and all researchers who have taken part on this study said that trust is linked to the ability of governments to engage on intergenerational issues. So this conclusion of the OECD and many other empirical studies consider that the perception of the government and the government's ability to act on intergenerational challenges and long-term challenges is key for trust, and that's not quite surprising based on everything that we've heard over the past 2 days, and you probably know why it's not surprising. Well, it's not surprising because trust, as we said, is looking at the future. That's an assumption of a future conduct, so it's taking some risk. It's a leap of faith. Of course, it's based on the past, on experience in the past, but there's a close connection with the future. So the fact that looking towards the future is a key for trust, it's a prerequisite of trust, if you like. And the fact that long-term issues and intergenerational issues, such as long-term issues, even if it's also for current generations, it can be explained by the fact that these issues are a source of concern already today for these generations, our generations, when we have some menace d'humanité, mankind threats that we're more and more aware of. First thing. Second comment. Trust seems to be key to raise to future challenges. So we've seen that trust can be a false friend in democracy. But precisely for the long-term challenges, a low level of trust can be a major democratic problem, because in order to face the transitions that will be necessary, trust is key. At least a certain level of trust is required, some kind of support, abstract support for solutions proposed, because trust is essential to face uncertainty, and uncertainty is what characterizes the mankind threats. And this is the characteristics of trust, to allow cooperation and coordination between human beings in imperfect knowledge situations, and that's the case for climate change. So trust is key just because we are in a time of uncertainties when it comes to climate change. Secondly, some kind of interpersonal and institutional trust is necessary so that everyone can accept. And earlier on with Jean-Benoît, we said it's important to accept and accept some sacrifices that are due to some transitions that will be quite costly. So there must be a minimum of trust in the fact that other individuals and public authorities will accept some sacrifices in the long term, so that myself, I can accept that. And trust is necessary to face the cost and investments that these transitions, organized or imposed, will imply. Especially empirical studies shows that the tax perception level, and we know we'll need revenues, is linked to the trust level. It's horizontal but also vertical. Now, the debt is a mechanism that is based on trust, more often trust in the markets, but also trust from the citizens. And when we're going to need revenues, it involves a minimum of trust. So, third bullet in this first part, the lack of trust in governments and authorities to face the long term is placed at different levels. I will start with the meta level. First, the first cause may be in the loss of ideologies, utopias, and so on. Jean-Domain has helped me a lot to understand this point. If we start from Paul Ricoeur's works in his reinterpretation of Max Weber, obedience is not just in the interest or a motivation through rational ideals, but it's also due to the belief in some form of legitimacy. So there is a part of belief in legitimacy. This supplement, as Paul Ricoeur said, those beliefs are ideology in the sense that it's a projection into the future. It's a utopia in the positive sense of the term for Paul, according to Paul Ricoeur. As Jean explained to me, Paul Ricoeur demonstrates that the legal domination never works by itself. There's always a charismatic part in it, a part of belief, of faith, that allows to put those beliefs, make those beliefs legitimate. So it's a bit archaic, but in the in democratic legitimacy, there's always a part of it, and this part of belief, charismatic belief, is hidden by the legal rationale in democracies, but it's still there. So we give some credit to an authority because beyond all calculations, it gives it an ideological status. But sociologists show that fictions that have this credit, the meta narratives, imaginations, are going through a crisis. So it affects the credibility of political institutions that are unable to make us go from instrumental relationships, managerial relationships, unable to have a resonance relationship, increasing our ability to react. That was for the meta part. Now, so imaginations are going through a crisis, and the great narratives that are projections into the future, which are decisive for the long term. And there's also the inability of our institutions to resonate. So, of course, this crisis of imagination and ideals is present on the literature on ecological transition, especially. I won't come back to this, but it's there. So, the lack of trust in the ability to act over the long term from citizens is explained by the low level of trust because of disappointing previous experiences. Thirdly, generally speaking, we can see that it's difficult for democracies to think in the long term. Many studies have tackled this. A lot of the literature is about the representation of future generations and the opportunity to give responsibility to those future generations. It's usually some legal responsibility in protection. Some in the literature apprehend this through constitutional principles, and they start from the principle of the continuity of the state, of the nation, of the constitution, that are concepts and principles that are trans or intergenerational. Others in literature start from the principle of political equality inside constitutionalism, that seems to require the representation of future peoples, but also seem to prevent the violation of these principles for the current peoples. Some think of the intergenerational crisis, and we find an intergenerational definition of sovereignty from 𝐥𝐢𝐧𝐞, but I didn't read it. Others think of the long-term challenges based on the future generation concept, but this idea is controversial in the literature because someone are warning against what this thinking over the long term can trigger, because we are not equal in projections in the future. Some studies show that in Oxford or Cambridge that have a long history, the members of these institutions more easily project themselves into the future because behind them they have a long history and they have reasons to believe that this will go on and on, because they are also better equipped to think about the future. It's less and there's really a problem on the political equality to project yourself into the future. So some might have a problem to seize the benefit of future generations. And so there's a whole part of the literature warning against thinking over the long term from future generations. But let's start with the current generations. And some others, such as Eric Buste, have analyzed the difficult relationship between the parliament and the long term, starting from the current generations. And there is the literature on representation and responsibilities of the non-human living things. And I will not talk about all this. I will limit myself to the issue of political accountability. It doesn't mean that this is not interesting, but I've already taken 10 minutes. So second part, political accountability and long term. So I won't come back to the definition of political accountability. But I would like to show here that political accountability, first part, has always been thought in a perspective and retrospective way, but we can see that there's a weakening of accountability for the future, or responsibility for the future, as Max Weber said. So now the issue of the long term implies that we think of the perspective dimension of a political accountability beyond the settling of accounts for the past. The responsibility or accountability of the governing bodies started from criminal trials. And quickly we realized that accountability had a double relationship with time. Accountability for the past, you have to justify your actions, you have to be accountable. you have to justify for the future. But on the other hand, and it is sometimes less obvious, the accountability is also a commitment towards the future, or a responsibility. So the link of this commitment for the future is the limit between responsibility and power. Responsibility or accountability is the idea of holding a power that you will be accountable for. Denis Barranger said, being accountable for something means that you focus the power in order to achieve this thing, to make it a reality. Hence, the idea that accountability is some kind of a test for your ability and not justifying your past action. So it's a responsibility of commitment for the future, asking about the willingness of changing things. I will skip the development about the relationship with power. Yeah, you're going to say, okay, this is all nice, but how do we define power? Well, that's not easy. Power is the ability to collective work in the benefit of the beneficiaries. The vote of confidence always has often embodied this responsibility, this power for the future. And this vote aims at confirming the confidence in the ability of a government to face future challenges and to implement its program. So these two dimensions are supposed to be coordinated, responsibility towards the future and accountability towards the past. But according to many analysts, the responsibility towards the future is going through a crisis. Why? First, because the inauguration or nomination vote is sometimes related to the ability to govern in a managerial way, and the influence on the future politics seems to have decreased. Bernard Manin has some explanations about this. He said, by voting for a political party with a detailed program, voters in the democracy of political parties a better ability to decide for themselves on future policies than when they were electing, as before, a trustee, a VIP that they trusted. The democracy of political parties increased the ability to vote based on political projects. But the common transformation say that this possibility will stop increasing when a candidate is elected based on his personal image and is trying to convince that he's more able than the others to face tomorrow's challenges. Voters are less able to make a decision on future decisions than when a political party would present a catalogue of measures. So that's for potential explanation. Another explanation is that all of the decisions about the future, the right to a future, as some people say, concerning the prevention obligations, these decisions are made at different levels in sometimes a system very complex with different levels of governance. This is where most of the long-term decisions are made. This is also where the decision framing, limiting the decision-making at the national level are made for long-term measures. But the problem for political accountability is that making someone accountable for this multi-layered system is extremely complex. I won't come back to all the developments, but let's retain that it's complicated to make someone accountable for a decision in the multi-layered, multi-tiered system, especially when you are a member state of the EU, given the complex decision-making process. and I send you back to Cecilia and Hugues' works on this. And then constitutionalization at the European level of certain rules involving a limit of discretionary powers of the states has subtracted some rules that were key for the long term, sometimes, to the test of accountability. Hence, a feeling of powerlessness among citizens that make them doubt of the ability of governments to have an influence on the future. To this, we also need to add, and this is an assumption, I would need to check that in parliaments, the objectives announced by governments are not taken seriously. The fact that even when there is a support to political accountability for the future, the parliament, in fact, doesn't seem to consider this, to take this seriously, and does not really does checks and controls of this responsibility. And then I would like to add again the problem of the lack of assessment, prospectively and retrospectively, of public policies and regulations. So that's for different potential explanations that are added to the general fact that representative democracy is focusing on the short term, favored by the different mandates, elections, and so on. I won't come back to this, but another potential explanation of the weakening or the low political accountability for the future is the inexistence of a political accountability towards future generations. It's very difficult to apprehend the political accountability in an intergenerational prospect because there is no mechanism organizes the accountability of governments for decisions they make now that would affect generations that don't exist yet. So if we could consider the institutions of a future people, it's impossible to have checks and controls for represented people that do not exist yet. Then an analysis of the proposals that aim at strengthening the accountability towards the future. I would like to say that here I will rule out some proposals that are a bit extreme, that are using the card of the projective will, often placed in the will of a single man or woman, but usually a man, or the exceptional cases or the state of emergency that, of course, strengthens the accountability for the future, but that represents some dangers, obviously, because it's a neo-Schmittian position. So I would retain other proposals, and I won't come back to this, the idea to go deeper on the political accountability through going deeper on the relationship between the trusters and the trustees. But I would like to come back to some institutions that have been proposed to go deeper on the information phase, the judgment phase, and if there is a negative judgment, some sanctions, by focusing them on the long term. Let's look at some proposals. Very often these are proposals developed in the literature based on practical experiences, hands-on experiences. So the proposal of a democratic trusteeship in international trusteeship. So there would be some trustees in which we would place a lot of trust so that they represent the interest of future generations because of their expertise. And this trusteeship would come down to giving some opinions to the parliament on the interest of future generations. And an ombudsman for future generations was proposed also, and his functions would be to investigate on current issues, to make reports, and to inform the parliament. Another proposal forcing the government to make reports about the future or to do posterity impact statement, that is to force the government to include the long term either in the statement of general politics or in the different actions, decisions, or draft regulations. And these projects should include an assessment of the long-term process. Another proposal, a committee for the future within the Parliament. These committees for the future several have been institutionalized in Finland, for example. Several experiences, not always very successful. And finally, last proposal that I would like to mention is to set up a public institute in charge of documenting and listing all the documents from political parties about the future. So an institute would make accessible and readable to all citizens the commitments of the different political parties on the long term, and to take everything they produced about the long term to allow the citizens and the parliament to make a judgment. So that's for first package of proposals. Second package, to complement the political accountability with legal responsibilities. If there's not enough political accountability for the long term, there could be some corrective measures that would be legal remedies to be organized to the benefit of future generations. So for us, as legal experts, it would be interesting to work on these different levers to counterbalance the absence or the failure of political accountability. But we have to be careful about the fundamental difference between those forms of legal responsibilities, whether they are enshrined in the European Court of Human Rights, for example, and the political accountability per se, which is something completely different, because it's this mechanism of authorization, of control, of being accountable, which the legal responsibility is not, and especially the positive obligation of protection. And then, as legal experts, we need to see how these responsibilities and accountabilities are organized, or what are the relationships between them. Another proposal would be to totally revise the representation relationship by having a legal autonomy for everyone, to make sure that everyone has equal resources to project into the future. So that's giving a better value for the information of Parliament by inviting the Parliament in their checks and balances of the government to document the current action and its implication for the future, so that it's easy to read for every citizen to provide the same ability to project yourself into the future, which is similar to political equality. And last proposal, in the ideal theory of democracy, that would be to have some representation for future generations and a political accountability in due form, but that would imply to revise constitutionalism and the whole constitutional organization of our state. That would be a conceptual revolution. So I wanted to conclude with a few words. I will conclude very briefly on the low profile that we should have as constitutional experts, because in such an issue, the different ideas that I've offered you might sound promising, and in fact we would need to assess them and to see how they can equip the Parliament and the citizens to be better informed, to have a better ability to judge and a better ability to sanction, probably. But the effect on the lack of imagination and ideals and narratives, I will let you judge that, but I think that would have no effect on this. Thank you very much for your attention.